We're glad to have you join us today for a discussion about Dr. Korzak's new paper, Managing Commercial Spyware Through Export Controls. We'd like to extend a special thank you to our co-sponsor, the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, for their support in making this event possible. Before we dive into what should be a fascinating conversation today, I have a few kind of housekeeping items to cover to make sure everything goes smoothly for everyone. Firstly, we're going to be doing a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. So if you think of any questions you'd like to ask, please submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then if you see something that someone has already asked that you're also interested in hearing the answer to, you can upvote their question so we can kind of prioritize the questions that a lot of people are interested in. And secondly, for those that are interested in kind of diving deeper on the research, the paper that this event is based on will be available through a QR code on our final slide, or you can also find it linked on our website at brsl.berkeley.edu. So I think that covers all the essentials, and I will pass things over to Leah, who will is the director of our center and will provide some opening remarks.
Thank you, Vivian. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in what is a lovely Wednesday morning in California and perhaps later wherever you are in the world. We're delighted to have this webinar today from Containers to Code, Export Controls for Commercial Spyware, which is meant to showcase a recent paper from one of our research scholars, Elaine Korzak, as well as start what I think will be an incredibly interesting conversation with three experts in this space, Andrew Grosso, James Shires, and Giacomo Persi-Paoli. Each of those panelists, including our own Dr. Korzak, have been involved in different aspects of the policy conversations around regulating spyware. So it'll be quite interesting to hear their perspectives, particularly as we are at a time in this new US administration where export controls are being a little bit shaken up. As we go through, please feel free to keep an active discussion in the chats. As Vivian mentioned, there is a Q&A function that we encourage you to use, and we're hoping that we can keep this a dynamic discussion. So please chime in as we go. With that, I'm delighted to introduce formally the paper author and our main speaker for this webinar, Dr. Elaine Korzak, who's a research scholar at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab, where I'm the executive director. And her research is focused on international legal and policy aspects of cybersecurity, including international law and norms in cyberspace, international cybersecurity negotiations at the UN, and commercial spyware governance, which she has covered for 10 years. Commercial spyware governance is also a topic that you will see an increasing amount of work coming from the lab as Dr. Elaine Korzak builds out that portfolio for us. So with that, I wanted to hand it over to you, Elaine, so we can hear more about managing commercial spyware through export controls.
Thanks, Leah, and thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity to give an overview of the white paper on managing commercial spyware through export controls, lessons learned from the Wassenaar experience, which was published this spring. Now, before I get into it, a quick word about definitions, and with the caveat that more in-depth discussion of these questions can be found in the paper. Just for the purposes of our webinar today, I wanted to say that there are many different terms and definitions out there. As a shorthand today, I will just use commercial spyware because it's easily recognizable term for expert and non-expert audiences that captures the main characteristic of these technologies, namely the ability to covertly obtain data without a user's knowledge or consent. Now, having covered this, where are we now in the international debate? We have seen that the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware technologies has first caused repeated and documented human rights harms worldwide, and more recently, also the non-proliferation and cybersecurity and national security risks have been taken up as a concern by the international community. Second, we have seen with this repeated pattern that it has turned into a persistent international policy problem that's been with us for a good 15 years by now. At the same time, the third point that we see in the international debate right now is that we have seen limited success with various governance responses. Now, this is not to say that we haven't seen any. On the contrary, we've had a plethora of non-governmental and governmental stakeholders putting out initiatives in this space, most recently and most notably the Pall Mall process, which has been spearheaded by the French and UK governments to address the unconstrained proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware technologies. Now, what I want to focus on today is one of those governance responses that we have seen today that has been the most deliberate and direct attempt to govern the misuse of commercial spyware technologies, and that is the use of multilateral export controls. So with this, let's dive into the main subject of the white paper, which looks at the regulation of spyware through multilateral export controls, and more specifically, the multilateral Wassenaar arrangement on export controls of conventional arms and dual-use technologies. Now, Wassenaar, this represented the first multilateral regulation attempt in the international community and dates back to 2013. And in my paper, I look at the Wassenaar controls in detail, and then I examine and compare the national implementation of the Wassenaar controls in the EU and in the US to then identify 3 important lessons learned from this first governance attempt. As a side note, the paper also contains a brief overview of other governance initiatives in the space and puts them into context with the Wassenaar controls. Now, for those of you who are not too familiar with the Wassenaar export control regime, it's a part of the multilateral non-proliferation regime for weapons of mass destruction and their delivery systems. And very much as its name suggests, it focuses on conventional weapons and dual-use items and technologies. Now, traditionally, export controls in this context balance economic interests. That means the interest that states have in selling technologies abroad with the national security and non-proliferation risk that such transfers might entail. It is important to note that the Wassenaar export controls do not constitute an export ban. Rather, they seek to control the flow of technologies by instituting licensing requirements. So when a company wants to export an item, a good or a technology abroad, they need to obtain a license from their home government. Now, it is also important to note that while things can be added to the Wassenaar export control list, they need to be implemented into national control lists to become effective. So Wassenaar controls need to be implemented on a national basis, in addition to the decisions made in the framework of the Wassenaar arrangement. When it comes to spyware technologies, we saw major development in 2013 when 2 specific types of technologies were added to Wassenaar's dual-use control list. The first was IP network surveillance systems, and the second was items related to intrusion software. Now, the context for these additions is very important to note, as they were in part driven by human rights concerns that followed revelations of widespread human rights abuses following the Arab Spring. Now, when we look at the implementation of these Wassenaar controls from 2013 in the EU and in the US, we get some interesting stories on both sides of the Atlantic that give us some insight into how this regulatory approach has gone so far. I'll start with the EU on the left-hand side first, where we saw a rather swift implementation in 2014, and where export controls fall under EU competence based on a Council regulation. Following that rather swift implementation, attention has shifted to the operationalization and the harmonization of controls in individual EU member states. We have also seen a greater revision of the EU export control regime that had been underway for several years, which contained a greater focus on containing cyber surveillance technology and human rights concerns. Now, this resulted in the recast dual-use regulation of 2021. And though it was not as far-reaching as the initial reform proposal suggested, the new recast dual-use regulation was markedly human rights-oriented and took a great deal to address cyber surveillance technology. Now, on the other hand, we have seen, on the other side, we've seen the US implementation that it was the opposite of a swift implementation. We had seen a delayed implementation that took 6 years to complete. In 2015, the Commerce Department set out to implement the 2013 additions to the Wassenaar arrangement and received major pushback from a variety of stakeholders, ranging from industry to the cybersecurity researcher community, that argued that in particular the items related to intrusion software were too far-reaching and would sweep up legitimate cyber defense tools. This resulted in the Commerce Department retracting the proposed rule and the US government actually going back to the Wassenaar arrangement itself to go back to the negotiating table to carve out exemptions for vulnerability disclosure and cybersecurity incident response in 2016 and 2017. And then finally in 2021, the US government implemented a new rule containing the 2013 Wassenaar controls with the amendments of 2016 and 2017. Now, as was the case in the EU, we've also seen broader reform efforts of US export controls with the adoption of the US Export Control Reform Act in 2018, which created another avenue to add cyber tools to export controls. But this reform effort was very much situated in the context of competition with China. In addition, we have also seen other initiatives in this area by the US government. Just to name one, in the area of export controls was the Export Controls and Human Rights Initiative in 2021. Now, what are the lessons learned that we can deduct from the different implementation experiences in the EU and the US? The first one is that export controls has become more complicated and more complex. We have seen new equities enter the equation, whereas states traditionally had to balance commercial interests and non-proliferation risks. With the implementation in the EU and the US, we have seen that human rights concerns have prominently entered the fray, as well as cybersecurity concerns. Second, we see that there are inherent limitations to Wassenaar controls, and this goes for export controls more broadly. And these limitations are manifold. For one, they only target one aspect of the product lifecycle, mainly the transfer, which means that they leave production, use, and all those other aspects of the product lifecycle untouched and unregulated. Second, we've seen that with the Wassenaar controls, only a very small slice of possible technologies was targeted with IP network surveillance technologies and items related to intrusion software. So a lot of the vast majority of technologies were left unregulated. And the third part is that the membership of Wassenaar is limited to 42 member states, which means that important states that are host to vendors in this space are not part to the Wassenaar arrangement and are thus not bound to its updated control lists. And the third aspect that I wanted to highlight as a lesson learned from the Wassenaar experience is their contentious nature, which has resulted in a stalemate in international discussions for several years. And only now we begin to see a little bit of a revival of export controls as a regulatory tool. But if you look at the timeline of 2013 and with the failed implementation attempt in the US in 2015, it's taken a good 10 years to sort of get back on a substantive policy discussion around export controls and how to make them more effective. With that, I'll hand it over to Leah.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was an excellent overview. And once again, I want to take this moment to encourage people to go read the report. I think it's an excellent piece of research. And to discuss its findings further, I'm delighted to open up the discussion with our three panelists. And so I will introduce them each, and then I'll turn it over to each of our panelists to give a few guiding points about how they've engaged with the spyware policy ecosystem to date. So to start, delighted to be joined by Andrew Grotto, who's a research scholar and the co-director of the Program of Geopolitics, Technology, and Governance at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. His research interests center on the national security and international economics dimensions of America's global leadership in information technology innovation and its growing reliance on innovation for its economic and social life. Before coming to Stanford, Andrew was the Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the White House in both the Obama and Trump administrations. Andrew, I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts about what's going on with the current administration. Then we're joined by James Shires, who's the co-director of Virtual Routes and managing editor of Binding Hook. He was previously a senior research fellow in cyber policy at Chatham House, and before that, an assistant professor in cybersecurity governance at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs, University of Leiden. He has written widely on issues of cybersecurity and international politics, including cybersecurity expertise, digital authoritarianism, spyware regulation, and hack and leak operations. Very much looking forward to hearing your view from Europe on these issues, James. And then we are joined by Giacomo Principali, the head of Program Security and Technology at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, or UNIDIR. We're lucky to have UNIDIR as a close partner at the lab. Giacomo specializes in the implication of emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and cyber, on international peace and security. His recent work focuses on the governance of these transformative technologies, including their impact on arms control, strategic stability, and global security frameworks. Giacomo also has a view of the multilateral institution approach to spyware, which we're looking forward to hearing about. So with those three excellent panelists, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love to go to each of you and hear from you personally how you've approached this question of spyware and export controls, and what are a few things that you're looking at in the current climate. Let's start with the order that I introduced. Andrew, let's turn this over to you.
Thanks, Leah, and congratulations, Elaine, on an outstanding report. Um, During my time in government, I had the opportunity to engage pretty closely with the original controls. Leah mentioned that I had served in the White House and the National Security Council, but before that, actually, was the Commerce Secretary's senior advisor for tech policy. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the way that export controls are set up in the United States, the agency that administers export controls for dual use items, including the cyber related controls, is part of the Department of Commerce. I got to the Department of Commerce in summer of 2013, shortly after Penny Pritzker, the secretary, was confirmed. Um, I didn't learn about these controls until weeks before the export control community, led by this department, the Bureau of Industry and Security within Commerce, were about to take them to the annual December meeting of the Wassenaar Arrangement countries. And I remember, it was almost a sort of oh, by the way, you're a cyber guy. We're working on these controls. And I remember looking at them and just thinking, ooh, okay, here we go. Um, I asked them, how much uh, exposure the rest of the government, particularly the parts of the government outside of the export control community, had seen these controls, and the answer was basically no. We work this exclusively within export control channels. And what's important to remember is now your export controls are in the news, right? We talk about chips, export controls, AI, right? It's sort of part of the mainstream, foreign policy security conversation, especially in the context of great power competition between the U.S. and China. But back in 2013, export controls was this wonky, cloistered policy domain administered by people who really hyper specialized in export controls and didn't really communicate much with the rest of the government. And so these controls were essentially developed without that first batch of controls were developed without any real meaningful input from cybersecurity experts who might be able to read the language and anticipate some of the criticisms that later came through. So fast forward, I get to the White House about 18 months after that, and we get a letter from, I think it was 108 members of Congress addressed to my boss, Susan Rice, a national security advisor, complaining about the controls. This is a bipartisan letter. And, I mean, if you know anything about American politics, that degree of bipartisan consensus is pretty remarkable. And the letter was essentially instigated by industry and who encouraged the members to write this letter. And that then set in motion this effort to try to fix address some of the shortcomings in the law. Now, what's interesting, or in the upcoming regulation. Now, what was interesting about that debate at the time, in addition to sort of the lack of sort of interagency coordination around the controls, was industry initially. The initial response was one I would describe of more sort of a reflexive ideological opposition to the government meddling in tech. I told a bunch of the companies that came to see me to talk about the controls, said, look, like we agree, the U.S. agreed to these at Wassenaar. For us to now change this means we need to persuade all the other countries in Wassenaar, and so that means we need like real reasons, not just this sort of like libertarian orientation that Silicon Valley and much of the digital tech ecosystem brings to these issues. And so and it actually took industry many months to put together a coherent critique of the controls, which I took as a sign that maybe the controls weren't quite as onerous as industry suggests. And I think Elaine kind of does a good job in her, especially good job in her report, kind of drawing this kind of put this give and take between the export control nerds in the government, U.S. government, industry, and some of these other stakeholders. Why don't I stop there and turn it back to you, Leah?
Great, thank you so much. I do think that's something I certainly want to get into the discussion later on, is the role of industry in all these processes. But before we get to that, I want to turn it over to James.
Thanks, Leah. So it's a pleasure to be here, and an even greater pleasure to be discussing such a fantastic paper from Elaine. So thank you very much for writing it, and I encourage everyone to read it in detail. The main purpose of my remarks now is just to briefly give an overview of what has happened in Europe, or the European perspective on export controls, seeing as one of the great strengths of Elaine's paper is to really contrast the European and the US experience, right? And just to outline that argument in a little bit more detail, Elaine gave the overview, but it's worth digging down a little bit more. Is this contrast between a real resistance to implementing export controls via Wassenaar in the US, with pushback from the cybersecurity industry, to an embrace of such controls at the EU level and in various EU states as well, and European states, right? Because I'm based in London, and the UK also has its own export control regime governed or flowing through from Wassenaar, with very similar approaches to the EU, but it's not part of the EU there as well. It is a major exporter of what they would call cyber surveillance items, or spyware or intrusion software. So worth noticing that alignment as well. And Elaine is absolutely right to say that the catalyst for export controls as a policy priority in Europe were human rights violations connected to the Arab Spring, often connected to European companies. While there were Canadian and US companies there as well, some of the major spyware scandals in the subsequent years really focused on European companies, and Finfisher and Hacking Team are the two most notorious, right? And these were the paradigm cases of spyware impacting human rights before we get to the modern day NSO groups and Predators and Paragons and the sort of Israeli nexus to spyware. And so you had this construction of the problem in Europe as an issue of Europe's contribution to human rights violations outside of Europe, right? It is the transfer of these capabilities, the export of these capabilities, that is a real danger here. And that leads you to think, okay, export controls are a natural solution to the problem. And so Wassenaar comes around. It's also worth saying that the Wassenaar amendments take place in the context of the Arms Trade Treaty renegotiation in 2014, to which the UK and France are major contributors, and it's putting a human rights frame on questions around arms trade more broadly, as well as dual-use items in export control. So that's the broad alignment with Elaine on the substance of the contrast between Europe and the US. Now, what I want to do, given that that was over a decade ago, is fast forward to where we are now, right? And Elaine highlights that we have a EU dual use regulation, right? Again, drawing on Wassenaar language. This regulation was highly contested when it was introduced in 2021. It was originally designed to go a lot further than Wassenaar, but it ultimately didn't do too much. It includes a lot of other cyber surveillance items as well as spyware. It includes a catch-all clause. So if you think, okay, there is another way in which these technologies might be violating human rights, you can still apply export controls to those technologies or the companies transferring those technologies. But what has happened most importantly over the last few years has been a series of spyware scandals in Europe itself, right? In Poland, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, in Cyprus, the list goes on, right? And all of these countries have had revelations where they have bought spyware, often from Israeli companies, and used it to target individuals within their countries, often in the case of Spain, in the context of secessionist movements, other than the case of fragile democracy and issues around journalists reporting highly politically sensitive issues. And in many of the countries as well, there is an increasing polarization as there is in the US. And so this has really flipped the frame on spyware in Europe. We have spyware not as an issue of human rights violations outside of Europe, to which European companies are contributing, but an issue of democracy and rights within Europe, where the most sophisticated capabilities are being sourced from outside Europe. And so you have this report on export controls coming out only in January, highlighting from at the EU level that this export still goes on, right? European companies are still developing spyware. They're still applying for licenses for cyber surveillance items. It's not broken down spyware specifically, and they're exporting them worldwide, right? Often in the global south, often to countries with very poor human rights records. But the focus of attention and debate now at the EU level and at the national level is on what is happening in Europe itself. These export controls do very little to address the misuse and abuse of spyware in Europe itself, especially if that spyware is homegrown, right? You can't, once it's in the internal market, once it's developed by countries for use domestically, then it's very hard for export controls to play a role in governing that use. And so there's been a real impetus to look elsewhere to things like the Pall Mall process, which I think we'll touch on later, to really try and broaden the way in which governance of spyware goes beyond export control to include intelligence oversight, to include industry practice as well, beyond this cross-border transfer. I'll stop there and we can explore more of this very shortly.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And I'm already seeing some comments in the chat that want to pull out some threads of what you just said. So we'll get to those in a moment. But I do want to give Giacomo the chance to give his perspectives, particularly given that you've been involved in the Pall Mall process. Giacomo, so we'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. And again, congratulations, Elaine, for this great report. I think I'll use the next few minutes to just provide this perspective on the kind of the privileged position of being an observer of everything that has been happening in the context of the UN, where you might not necessarily get the same depth of discussions that you would get in a national or highly aligned regional context, but you definitely get a sense of the breadth of views and positions that exist on this topic. And I think this paper comes out at I don't know if it was by design or not, but it came out in a very strategic timing, because I see fundamentally the convergence of three trends. One is building on the fact that the international cybersecurity community has evolved significantly since these conversations were first held 10, 12 years ago. Not only it has changed in the individuals that may not necessarily have memory of what was happening 10 to 12 years ago, and suddenly what's old is new again, but our understanding of the threats, our understanding of the problem and of the magnitude of and the complexity of the problem has also evolved with it. So Having observed the last 5 years of the open-ended working group on ICT security here in the UN, particularly thanks to the Pall Mall process, we've seen an increased awareness of the threat posed by commercial spyware to national security and therefore international peace and security. And I would like to underline that because while the catalyst may have been around human rights violation, the discussion that at least part of the discussion that I'm witnessing are really focused on national, regional, and international security. So it's a slight different perspective. Nevertheless, in the last year or two, we've seen an increased number of states also following the leadership of the champions of the Pall Mall process bring this topic to the table. And why is that important? It's important because the OWG is wrapping up in 2 weeks. They will have the last session of this 5-year process, but this is not the end of it. So states have already agreed that following this process, there will be a new permanent mechanism that is going to be set up. They're still negotiating, and the jury's out on whether or not they will agree on the specifics about this mechanism. But one general aspect that seemed to have been agreed on is that it will focus a lot more on the implementation side. There are these norms, these rules that have been agreed on by states, but so far in the last 5 years, the discussion has been around these norms and not necessarily into how do you implement them. And that's where discussions on what can we do to counter the proliferation of commercial spyware, how does the proliferation of commercial spyware relate to some of the norms that have been already agreed. And it can be norms on due diligence, can be norms on protecting your own critical infrastructure, or do not support malicious cyber activities from your territory. There is a plethora of norms and rules that can be directly or indirectly impacted by the proliferation of commercial spyware. So this transition from the current process that was very political in nature to the next process, which hopefully will at least have one branch of it that will be more operational, is definitely helping a lot. So that was the first trend. The second trend is that so far the international cybersecurity community and the international arms control disarmament community have been operating in silos, I have to say. There is often different people that follow different files, that often respond to different national agencies, and they often don't talk to each other. However, within the UN, the whole topic of governance of new and emerging technologies, which does include cyber and does include potentially commercial spyware, is starting to be really debated more widely and not just within the community of cyber folks. And as a result of it, you start seeing more and more states questioning, wait a minute, we have a number of arms control and export control tools that have been negotiated over the years. To what extent can we leverage these existing tools in order to mitigate some of the risks related to the proliferation of a number of digital technologies, including commercial spyware? So the last trend that I wanted to highlight is also the fact that you have the one process that is kind of ending with the new one starting. You have a more general interest by the multilateral community at looking at existing tools that could be leveraged to counter these threats. And then the last trend, I think it's really more of a cognitive and perception kind of trend that really speaks to the understanding of this community of the subject. I think the subject as a whole is leaving kind of the community of enthusiasts or kind of the community, a very small community of specialists, and is becoming, because of the incidents that have been happening, because of how mainstream this topic is becoming, is getting to the attention of the generalist policymakers. And this, in the multilateral processes, can only be an advantage because it allows these topics to be voiced in a much more concrete way. And I'm really hopeful that despite what's happening around the world, that may suggest that advances at the multilateral stage might be not as quick or significant as we want, I still do believe that there is scope for action at the multilateral level on this topic. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Giacomo. And I'll come back to you in a moment to talk more about, forward-looking potential actions on the multilateral level. But first, I want to go back to James because you highlighted very nicely for us the shift from earlier spyware companies and the increasing amounts of spyware companies not in Europe, but in places like in Israel. And that's one of the questions that we have in the chat, which is how has the Wassenaar Agreement approached sanctioning countries with a large amount of spyware companies? And so if you could just talk through how that's gone, whether it's sanctions towards the country itself, whether it's on specific companies, and whether there's been a shift in how those in the application of those sanctions as we've seen that geographic shift in terms of epicenter of the epidemic.
Sure. So there's a lot there, and hopefully you can still hear me. Get a little pop-up. I'll keep on going. So in terms of the Wassenaar arrangement, this is not a sanctioning entity, right? The Wassenaar arrangement is an agreement between countries to regulate munitions and dual-use items, right? And so countries that are not part of the Wassenaar arrangement are not within its scope. They can do whatever they want, right? They can't, maybe countries within the Wassenaar arrangement can't export to those countries, but the Wassenaar arrangement does not control those countries. Israel is not a member of the Wassenaar arrangement, and so it is not governed, it is not required to implement national export controls that follow the export control lists published by the Wassenaar arrangement. So there's no sense in which the Wassenaar arrangement ever could sanction the nation of Israel. A footnote there, Israel does claim to follow the Wassenaar arrangement voluntarily. So they say that their export licensing regime is aligned with that of Wassenaar, but it's also very hard to demonstrate that. And several very high-profile instances of Israeli spyware companies suggest that whatever interpretations the Israeli export control bodies are making, they are often not aligned with those that other Wassenaar countries would expect. Now, moving on away from the Wassenaar arrangement to sanctions on Israeli entities. So here you have the US as a major actor, right? Several Israeli companies, Kangaroo, NSO Group, have been subject to US sanctions. This has made a significant impact on them, on their viability as companies, on investors' decisions to invest in those companies. And the US has gone further. So they're now looking to implement further restrictions, not necessarily sanctions, but also visa restrictions on CEOs, people who benefit from these companies and their families as well. So the US has taken very specific action to target people and companies involved in abuses of spyware. But this has not led to national level sanctions as suggested in the question, sanctioning Israel itself. Quite the opposite. As far as we can tell, Israel has used the sale of commercial spyware as diplomatic lubrication, right, to enable conversations with states that are not very comfortable with it, maybe in the region, maybe even around the Abraham Accords with the UAE and others, to start conversations, to open diplomatic doors where it would otherwise be hard to do. And so, if anything, from a diplomatic perspective, Israel has used spyware to its advantage rather than being subject at a country level to these sanctions.
Thank you so much, and that's an appreciated clarification. With that current climate in mind, I do want to turn it over to Andrew. We've got some questions about low-hanging policy fruits and where governments might be able to make more of a difference in the coming years. And I know you have some thoughts about where the current US administration is going. And so I'd love to give you the chance to talk through those.
Yeah, sure. So the points to lay out now are extend across export controls, and not just controls on cyber related capabilities. I think one big shift that is underway in U.S. export control policy is towards a much more transactional approach to export control. So James mentioned the example of Israel potentially using access to these capabilities as part of a bigger geopolitical bargain. The Trump administration is now doing the same. I think the meetings in the Middle East back in last month, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all featured what seemed to me to be pretty clear horse trades for relaxed export controls on semiconductors in exchange for commitments to invest in the United States and maybe even a plane from Qatar. Second big shift, I think it's a little less visible, but this is what I'm hearing from sources in Washington is there's a lot of skepticism about multilateralism. Which won't come as a shock to people who follow this administration, but its extension to export controls may be surprising because historically, export controls, the effectiveness of export controls are really dependent on international cooperation. There's this great saying that Taya Kendler, the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration in the Biden administration, used to say, you can't dam half a river, which kind of tries to capture the idea that if export controls aren't multilateral, well, other countries will just backfill cut off supplies. This administration thinks that the existing processes for export controls are simply too slow, and this goes beyond the Boston arrangement. I mean, I think it's maybe worth pointing this out explicitly. I mean, the Boston arrangement as an institution, as a platform for export controls, I don't want to declare it dead, but I think it's on life support, and that's because it operates by consensus. Russia is one of several members in the Boston arrangement that has problematic ideas about how the world should work and has essentially shut that organization down. And so now you have this plurilateral approach where the U.S. and allies are collaborating not just on Russia export controls, but on, say, quantum related export controls, chips, and so on. And even in those cases, I think the administration is professed skepticism, and it has in U.S. law there are these long-arm jurisdictional tools like the Foreign Direct Product Rule that essentially allow the U.S. to assert jurisdiction over items produced in other countries if those items were either produced using American equipment or contain some percentage of American parts that are subject to export controls. And I think there's a desire to move away from multilateral export controls and towards using these sort of unilateral tools more robustly. And the last point, shift is I've observed is there's a lot of frustration with perceived loopholes in export control laws that allow companies to continue to do business with China, and so this is really a China-driven matter. But that's generated this sense that we need to make export controls simpler, which means, in their view, eliminating exceptions, making the licensing process much more difficult, making export controls have more of a blanket effect as opposed to the more surgical, scalpel-like approach that's characterized export controls for the past, few decades.
Great, thank you so much. And that's, certainly something we've been observing across our different lines of efforts at the lab. I do want to take up your point of the current administration's skepticism about multilateralism and sort of turn that over to Giacomo and ask you, given that skepticism coming out of DC, what does the future look like for multilateral efforts on spyware like the Pall Mall process?
Thank you. I'll try to be brief in the interest of time. It's a very good question. I think that it's not just about this. Like, the future of multilateralism is currently being questioned and reviewed in many different aspects. But I think that if we stay close to the topic, I think that if we maintain kind of our sight on on the goal that we have in mind. So what is the goal that we have, which is to counter proliferation of commercial spyware and malicious tools. It doesn't really matter under which framework you are operating. It can be the Wassenaar, it can be a set of Wassenaar, it can be a constellation of something else, it can be a whole new framework. So to me, what I'm looking at right now is I'm hoping that through processes like the Pall Mall process, through the new UN mechanism on international cybersecurity, there will be a platform to oh, sorry, I just got a message saying you're still muted. Well, hopefully I'm not. Otherwise,
We can hear
okay,
you
good.
clearly, at least
Awesome.
I can. So I think you're all set.
Great. Otherwise, I've been speaking for 3 minutes to no one. So what I'm hoping is that through these processes, we can bring the knowledge and expertise. We can increase the knowledge base and the expertise and the capacity of states to have tighter controls over these technologies, to have the opportunity to implement and design mechanisms that will ultimately contribute to countering the proliferation of the tools. So let's try to focus more on the goals that we're trying to accomplish and make sure that we equip and we build capacity to do that in the highest number possible of countries. And if we do that, I'm relatively optimistic that if we maintain this positive agenda of building capacity, of fostering collaboration and cooperation, a platform like the UN might still bring added value over more kind of unilateral or smaller like an initiative by a smaller group of states.
Thank you for that. And I mean, I'm inclined to believe that you're right. I also think the work that you do at Unity is also so important in terms of information sharing and sharing research about emerging risks across the different member states. I've seen certainly value add from the work that you do there. I want to go back to Elaine. We've talked a lot about export controls, and that is the topic of this webinar, but there's a lot of challenges and hurdles that we've heard from each of the participants in terms of continuing to apply those in an effective way. And Elaine, I just want to give you the chance because I know you've been doing some more work on alternative approaches to mitigating spyware, particularly in terms of legal challenges that private industry can put in. If you could give us a bit of thoughts about how you're approaching that issue now, particularly the NSO and WhatsApp case.
Sure. And then if it's all right, I'll also pick up the questions that Jennifer Brody had put in the chat. The last one was how the Pall Mall process code of practice could help in countering commercial spyware. So I'll try to do a roundup on all these issues, the general regulation forward, what are the next steps? And I'll sort of start with a more pessimistic outline first, which is that, we haven't seen, it's become and I really believe that it's become a persistent international policy problem. And we haven't seen a whole lot of progress in spite of years of debate on these issues. And I think fundamentally at the core of it is a problem that we face is that states are the center to a lot of these efforts. States are the host states for these companies. States are the purchasers of these technologies. States are the users of these technologies. And at the same time, they're the regulators, both in terms of exports, regulating exports, but they're also regulators of their own behavior. And, I think James knows this. I had this, joke about my toddler, because the Pall Mall process came up with a responsible behavior, responsible use of these technologies. And, if you put a chocolate cake in front of a 3-year-old and told her to eat it responsibly, I think her opinion, her view on what responsibly would look like would be different from, the parents' view of what responsible behavior would look like in that situation. So I think that's that's at the core of why a lot of these governance issues are so frustratingly slow moving and incremental is because states need to regulate to some extent their own behavior, and they need to see the upside or the interest in regulating, in that it is better to regulate certain aspects than to leave the bulk of it unregulated. And that, to me, overshadows a lot of the current international governance initiatives that we have seen. So the Palmal process is at the center of it, and it's very commendable to the governments of the UK and France, which coincidentally also were the ones bringing the Wassenaar controls in 2013 to the table to take on this issue. And I think we've seen in the last 2 years that it is a really hard problem. And it is really difficult to get states to move. So we see that the code of practice is making some progress, but I think, a lot of non-governmental stakeholders see a lot of room for improvement. So with that, as it has been over the past decade, we're shifting our attention to other initiatives outside of government. So Leah has mentioned the litigation efforts. We've seen that WhatsApp has won their case against NSO Group and has been awarded close to 170 million US dollars in damages. So that has been an avenue that has turned out to be highly successful. But of course, questions remain of how scalable such an effort is, because it is very time and resource intensive. So this is not to say there are no other policy levers or responses to the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware technologies, but I think we've seen that at the core, states play a very central role, and until and unless they address their role in a fundamental way and show political will and willingness to constrain their own behavior, we're sort of going to be chipping away at this issue on the margins. So that is a less than hopeful note to end the seminar on. Maybe somebody else has a more optimistic take on the future, but I'll leave it at that. So I think just to close up with Jennifer Brody's other question of the low-hanging fruit and export control. So I think now we see this pivot. I very much like Giacomo's sentence of, the old is new again. Now we see this pivot again to, okay, so what do we have in place already and how can we make that work better? So obviously looking at human rights due diligence and export control, licensing decisions is quote unquote a low-hanging fruit. That's a natural point of entry to start to make the things that we already have effective. So there's a bifurcation. We can look at starting new initiatives and getting new things on paper and agreeing to new things. And we can also look at making the things that we already have more effective and focusing on the implementation side of things, focusing on harmonizing how states go about implementing the things that they've already agreed on. But to say to give a hopeful account at the end, it doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive. I think what we need to get away from in the debate is a little bit this trying to look for a silver bullet that will solve it all, but embracing an approach that is based on a web of measures where we know that we need to have different policy levers that target national, regional, international levels that also come from non-governmental stakeholders and governmental stakeholders. And we need to make sure that all those different policy levers overlap in the most effective and constructive way possible.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I think that is some excellent final points. We have one last question in the chat. So if you don't mind, I might send it over to you quickly, Giacomo, if you'd like to have that question.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. I wasn't sure we wouldn't have the time. So a range of possible next steps. So states have agreed that the new mechanism will be permanent. There are a couple of things that still need to be ironed out, and the question is, will they achieve consensus on those final elements? Whether it's about the thematic working groups, the participation of stakeholders, and kind of the extent to which the new mechanism will deal with international law and the potential negotiations for new norms or a new treaty. These are kind of the three big question marks that still exist. If, for any reason, states in 2 weeks, 3 weeks do not reach consensus on the full package, what may happen are two things. Either they'll say, we agree on this portion of the future mechanism, and we kick the ball to the first committee to agree, actually to the mechanism itself, to start the negotiations, trying to sort out these unresolved questions. Or the ball is going to be a kick to the first committee, where it's likely that different camps will put forward their proposals for what the new mechanism should look like. And if in that scenario, it is very likely or plausible that both proposals, or three, or how many there are, but let's say there are two proposals, both will receive enough votes, to be taken forward, and that will create like a parallel tracks kind of a process, which is something states have been trying very hard to avoid. In any case, the development of new norms, including the one that's been suggested in the chat, is one of the topics that is being considered. There are a number of new norms that have been put on the table, and I think right now states are split between those that really want to add new norms and those that instead want to focus on the norms that are already there and really trying to understand to what extent are they being implemented and at what extent are they useful.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I think we are coming to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, from the participants to the panelists. Thank you, James, Andrew, and Giacomo, for taking the time, for answering our questions, for engaging with all of the participants. Elaine, thank you so much for your presentation. Congratulations again on an excellent paper. I once again recommend that everyone go and read Elaine's report. I think that it's a really great overview of export controls for spyware through Wassenaar, and I encourage you to keep an eye on further publications from Elaine, because I personally am quite excited about some of the additional spyware work that she has coming, including some that we teased in this webinar. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. We invite you to join more BRSL events in the future, so please keep an eye on our website, join our newsletter, all of those things. And of course, check out the wonderful work from Andrew, James, and Giacomo on these issues and others. Thank you, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day, wherever you might be in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.